We're okay. To get my notes. Welcome everybody to our first ever webinar on this subject, which we call this Your Genes and What You Need to Know. Straight talk about genetic testing. This is in celebration of Jewish Genetic Awareness Week. And we have a really great panel today. It's a fascinating subject that's both taboo and of high interest. And we really hope to get into, do a little deep dive. We have about an hour. We're going to have a section for questions from the audience. And before we start the show, the most important part is I want to welcome the co-founder of GeneTest Now. This webinar is co-sponsored by GeneTest Now, JScreen, and Jewish Journal. So I want to invite the co-founder of GeneTest Now, Sharon Glazer, to say a few words.
Thank you, David. And welcome to everybody. I want you to know that my brother, Jerry Factor, and I co-founded GeneTest Now in 2012. So we've been at it for a long time. We're into our 9th year. Now, it was our partners, David Suissa and Rob Eshman at the Jewish Journal, who created our very interesting format. And it all began and wonderful, wonderful, many years and a wonderful journey. And here we are today. We want you to know our mission has always been to make everybody aware and to educate. And now through Zoom, we are able to present with JScreen, also a partner, and you'll learn the importance of genetic screening. And David Suissa, you are the moderator, you are the editor in chief and publisher of the Jewish Journal. And so take it away, David, and have a good time educating everyone.
Oh, thank you, Sharon. It's been a great journey working on this cause. Let me introduce the panel. We have Daniela Camara, a licensed genetic counselor with UCLA Health, and she's the genetic counselor consultant for GeneTest Now. Hillary Kenner Regelman is the director of national outreach and marketing for JScreen, which is coordinated through the Emory University Department of Human Genetics. And then finally, my friend, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, American Jewish University's rector and Saul and Ann Dorff Distinguished Service Professor in Philosophy. He is also co-editor of the book, Jews and Genes, The Genetic Future in Contemporary Jewish Thought. So why don't we kick off the webinar right there, Professor Dorff, if you can tell us why this is an important issue and what are some of the ethics surrounding this issue?
So, I mean, the ultimate ethic is that we have a duty to preserve our health. That goes back to something very fundamental in the Jewish tradition, namely that unlike the American tradition in which I own my own body, in the Jewish tradition, my body belongs to God, and I have fair use of it during my life. It's as if you were renting an apartment. You have fair use of that apartment, but you may not destroy it. You may not harm it. As a matter of fact, you have to take reasonable care of it. And in the same sort of a way, the way that the Jewish tradition understands us is that we have a fiduciary duty to God to take care of our bodies, and that means preventive care as well as curative care. And in the case of genetic testing, this is one way to try to make sure that the children that we have are healthy and are not burdened with a genetic disease. And let me just tell you a personal story. My younger son is a physician, and when he and his wife were about to have children, they were tested for what was then, this was 17 years ago, what was then the panel of Jewish genetic diseases. and they came out with a clean bill of health. So they had their first child, and it turned out that that child had Fragile X syndrome, which is not any more common among Jews than it is in the general population. And that's why it was not then part of the panel of Ashkenazi Jewish diseases, but it is among the more common genetic diseases. Interestingly, Israel at that time tested for it. My grandson is now 16 years old. He had to be institutionalized several years ago because because of all the deficits of Fragile X that ultimately once puberty happened, he has no way of understanding what's going on in his body, and he became violent, and so therefore had to be institutionalized. You want to avoid that. And by the way, my son and daughter-in-law did with their second child, in which they use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. That is, you take sperm from the man, you ovulate the woman, you put their sperm and eggs together in a petri dish, cultivate them for a few days, by which time each of the embryos is about 200 cells. And you take one cell from each of the embryos and you implant into the woman only those embryos that are free of the disease. And as a result, my granddaughter is free of that disease. And, and I was about to say is normal. She's actually wonderful. She's my granddaughter after all. The point that I'm after here is that even if you are a carrier of one of the genetic diseases, that does not mean that you cannot have a healthy child. So you shouldn't avoid being tested simply because you're worried about not being able to have a healthy child. You should also not be worried about being tested for fear that you are going to somehow or another be looked at as damaged goods in terms of things like marriage. Because even if most of us are carriers of something, but even if you are a carrier of one of the more prominent diseases, that does not at all mean that you cannot have children that are perfectly healthy. I mean, even the most common and the most prevalent of Ashkenazi Jewish diseases, Tay-Sachs and familial dysautonomia, are only 3% of us Ashkenazi Jews are carriers. That's 10 times the amount in the general population, where it's 0.3%. But that still means that 97% of us are not carriers, right? So, I mean, it's important to understand that we are not a diseased population. And even if we are a carrier, it's important to understand that we can still have children that are perfectly normal. And therefore, you really have a duty to the future generation, to the next generation, to do what you can to prevent illness. And genetic testing is a critical way of doing that.
Daniela, you're in this field. You're a licensed genetic counselor. Many years ago, the tradition is that Jews only worry about Tay-Sachs.
Yeah.
One or two. Can you talk a little bit about the progress that has been made in terms of the amount of disease now that you can screen for?
Yeah, absolutely. So Tay-Sachs, I think, gets spoken about the most because it was really used internationally, globally, as the disease that was the pilot for how we started genetic testing. And actually, when that was started in the Ashkenazi Jewish community, genetic testing, the way we know it today, wasn't actually even done, or it wasn't done in a way where we could test, all Ashkenazi Jews. We didn't have that level of technology. So it was actually, they would do enzyme testing to determine if people are carriers. It wasn't even actually genetic testing. They would look for levels of certain enzymes in people's blood to determine, if they had full enzyme, 50%, and that's how they would determine carriers. Since that time, genetic testing has gone from something that wasn't done outside of a lab to something that, people can order at home almost, kind of thing. The technology has exploded and become a lot more accessible, a lot more affordable. And with that, we've gone from the idea of testing individuals based on their ancestry. So like Rabbi Dorff said, the individual that is Ashkenazi Jewish gets an Ashkenazi Jewish panel. The person who is Asian gets a panel of 4 conditions that are most common in Asian individuals, to this idea where we do kind of pan-ethnic panels on everybody. So the technology is today in a way built that really looking at one gene and looking at 250 genes is the same. So generally speaking, in today's genetics world, anybody that comes through the door for carrier screening gets one of these pan-ethnic panels that's looking at usually over, I want to say, 200 genetic conditions that are common in all different ancestries and exist in the population, because we know that although Tay-Sachs, yes, is more common in people of Ashkenazi Jews, there are plenty of people that aren't Ashkenazi Jewish that are also Tay-Sachs carriers. And the same go for other diseases as well. And so it's really important, if we're really trying to empower people with the information for them to keep themselves and their families healthy, for them to have all the information, not only kind of the tip of the iceberg, what's most likely.
How interesting that there's a Jewish unity component to this world. The fact that I'm a Sephardic Jew and I feel comforted to know that I will also be tested for Tay-Sachs, and that we're all in this together is what I'm hearing.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of progress, Hillary, you're with JScreen. One of the things I found really most exciting about this whole project since we started was the growth in the ability to screen so easily. A few years ago, when we were sponsoring testing sessions on Sunday mornings, you know, you'd have to have nurse with a needle, take blood, all that stuff. So can you speak a little bit about how you initiated this movement of JScreen, the saliva testing, and how you've made it so easy?
Yeah, we've certainly come a long way since the Tay-Sachs screenings that Daniela is referring to, where you had to go in and get your blood drawn at a big community event or wherever it was. You know, you'd get multiple vials of blood drawn, and then, you know, you'd be waiting for the results. So nowadays it's so much more simple, and JScreen's really innovative in that space, in that, you know, we were built for this pandemic, but we started 7 years ago doing this at-home testing model. And the most important part, though, is that medical professionals are involved the entire way. And I know Daniela touched a bit on, you know, doing things the right way and doing it at home, but making sure that it's done accurately with genetic counselors involved, such as Daniela, it's essential. And with our test, yes, it's done at home, and you literally don't even need to leave. You provide a saliva sample. There's even prepaid postage for you to mail it back. But the telehealth portion is done through a genetic counselor via either phone or video teleconference. And that's really to receive your results and understand what it is that you're being tested for, what it means to be a carrier of these diseases, you know, what that disease is and entails. And then for couples whose risk is elevated, right, for these carrier couples who carry the same disease, they need to understand what that means to be able to make decisions like Rabbi Dorf's own family members, his son and daughter-in-law, as to what are the options that we're going to choose next. Are we going to go that IVF route with PGT, or are we going to choose to adopt? Are we going to choose to use a sperm or an egg donor? Are we going to choose to just, you know, roll the dice, and each pregnancy is at its own risk? So are we going to choose to just monitor that pregnancy, since now we know what disease to look for in an amniocentesis? So, you know, the purpose of JScreen's test is informative, and we all believe, obviously, that knowledge is power, and it's really the first step in family planning. And then what people choose to do next, you know, they would meet with a rabbi like Rabbi Dorf, their own rabbi, maybe perhaps for some guidance. They could meet with a geneticist or a genetic counselor, speak with their parents, and it's really up to them what they're going to do with those results. But the purpose of JScreen is to give that comprehensive test, you know, from their home, and help make sure that they're making informed decisions when family planning.
Daniela, forgive me if this is a silly question, but how is this kind of screening different from the one everybody's talking about, 23andMe?
Excellent question. It's actually the best question these days. I think I want to just add one more point just about these large panels, and then I'll answer your question. I think it's also really important for a perspective to know, you know, there's diseases like Fragile X, like Tay-Sachs, like, you know, these very severe genetic conditions that really, I mean, are just can be tragic to a family and a person. And there are also diseases on there that are much more mild, that are not as detrimental, that can be managed with treatment, effective treatment. If it's caught early, kids can do really well. And so I think that's also an important piece to remember in terms of how these results can really differ in their impact and how people make those decisions. Your question, David, how is this different than the ancestry testing, the 23andMe's that everyone is talking about? So on a fundamental level, genetic testing that's ordered by a healthcare provider, as Hillary said, there's a healthcare provider every step of the way. You can't actually order the J-screen test for yourself. You can go in and request it, but there is a medical provider on the other side that's verifying everything and kind of checking the boxes, and then is going to counsel you on those results after, versus a 23andMe or an Ancestry or some of these other direct-to-consumer tests that we see where you go on, you order it for yourself, and there's no medical provider involved. The actual analysis, the actual genetic testing that gets done is different. There are two different types of testing, and the ones that require a medical provider involvement are much more robust and much more accurate. Now, I always tell people, you know, these direct-to-consumer tests, science project for a rainy day, ancestry stuff, fun, weird, random traits, all good, you know, as long as you understand the limitations, it's all fine. Using it for medical decisions, using it for medical management, using it as a replacement for carrier screening or other types of genetic testing that have been recommended for you, either because of a personal history or family history, it will not be the same. It's not enough. So a lot of people will see me and say, oh, I already did 23andMe, I don't need any more testing. But the fact is, they're not comparable in that way at all.
Well, you know, 23andMe, I think, is bringing Jews together. Every Ashkenazi friend I have that's done 23andMe has come and told me, I have 1.8% Sephardic, or everyone's got a tiny percentage of Sephardic. God bless them. Elliot, I have a big picture question to ask you. The whole world and progress in the world of genetics enters into a world that can have some real ethical dilemmas. So here we seem to be in the safe space of staying alive, preventing diseases. That's a safe space. So do you have any concerns that this thing can go too far? I know you've written so much about Jewish ethics and medical ethics, because I hear stories about, you know, the manipulation of genes and so forth. Is that on your radar?
Oh, sure. And as a matter of fact, there's in the book that you referenced that I co-edited with Lori Zoloff, Jews and Genes, there's an entire section on genetic intervention, a whole section on genetic identity, genetic testing, one on genetic identity, one on genetic testing, one on genetic intervention. In terms of testing, the issues that I think arise have to do with, well, what are you testing for, and what are you going to do with those results? So here we're talking about we're talking about genetic diseases of all sorts, right? And then you have to deal with what Danielle was talking about before. What is the severity of the disease if one is discovered? What is the severity of the disease? And you know, are you going to choose against that embryo because that is a severe genetic disease, or are you not going to choose against it? And with testing, it can be not just a genetic disease, right? I mean, that's what the genetic tests are about. But what happens if you find out that the embryo is going to be deaf or blind? Right? You choose against that. And if you do that, then what is that going to say about the disabled people in our own community? And if you continue to do that over a generation, what will be the accommodations for disabled people in our society? Right? Will people be blamed for having a disabled person if they could have tested beforehand and chosen against using that embryo? So I mean, you have all kinds of moral questions in regard to testing. Let me say very quickly, very hastily here, that has nothing to do with testing testing it for and then choosing against a child with a severe genetic disease. That, I think you owe it to the child as well as to everybody else, to choose against implanting a child that's going to have a severe genetic disease. In terms of genetic intervention, that gets even stickier, right? Because you would, if we had the ability, and at this point with CRISPR-9, and we have a method for actually editing the genetic code. Now you would hope that, or at least you might think on one end of the spectrum, if you could identify a severe genetic problem, let's say deafness, and you were able to correct it in utero, maybe even correct it in not only in the somatic cells, that is in the cells of this particular embryo, but in the genetic cells of that embryo, so that any of the offspring of that embryo would also be hearing and not deaf. You would think that, well, yes, we should do that. But then the question is, well, what about other kinds of things, right? Are you going to try to create the designer child? And if so, who is that designer child? Is that designer child Albert Einstein? Is that designer child, Hank Aaron, one of my heroes as I was growing up in Milwaukee, the center fielder for the Milwaukee Braves? Is that designer child some, is it an entertainment person? Is it a political person? Is it a scientist? Is it an editor of a Jewish newspaper? Hopefully it's not a philosopher. Okay, right. Who is that designer? And of course, you get, of course, immediately into eugenics issues, right? And the American, and by the way, eugenics was very, very popular in America 100 years ago. The Nazis actually learned it from us. And so we Americans have to be, really concerned about that kind of issue, both in terms of the genetic testing end of it and in terms of the genetic intervention of it and the end of it. But again, this has nothing to do with what we're talking about. What we're talking about is testing for genetic diseases and responding to them based upon the severity of the particular disease if it is indeed present.
Well, Elliot, it warms my heart that we have the fearlessness in the Jewish tradition to confront all the issues, no matter how complicated and how delicate they are. And I applaud you for that. And this is something we ought to keep an eye on. Danielle, I'd like to ask you, if let's say you're a young couple about to get married and both the husband and the wife, they're both couple, they test for the same diseases. Are there any special issues to consider?
Like they're both carriers for the same disease?
They're both carriers of the same disease.
So I think oftentimes, historically in the Hasidic community where there was matchmaking done when they were setting up marriages, historically we have this idea of, okay, so those two people wouldn't be paired together. They would be another combination of a couple would be paired together through the matchmaker. Outside of the Hasidic community and in more modern times today, you have people falling in love, dating, and getting married. Genetic testing should never be a reason for somebody to say we can't get married now. That's not at all where we go with this. Things to consider, again, what are these diseases? Is it a mutation in a gene that causes maybe some mild hearing loss? Is that something that's very important to that couple? Or is it something like Tay-Sachs where, this potentially their children could have a disease that, doesn't let them live beyond a very young age and a very sick life. It's also important to consider that people that are carriers for the same diseases, there's a 25% chance of having a child that's affected, 75% chance of having a healthy child. Now, again, depending on the disease, its severity, some people say, you know what, I'm okay taking those chances. We can either test the pregnancy early or test the baby right when it's born and determine if we need to intervene with some sort of treatment right at that time. Other people would say, there's no way I am taking that chance. But the point is, and I think this speaks to what Rabbi Dorf was just saying, having this information ahead of time allows you to be put in a situation where you can make the decision that works for you. I think another piece that people don't think about is having a child that's born with a very severe illness is extremely costly. And to have that child and not be able to care for it adds a whole other level and dynamic of stress on that relationship and hardship for that family. And we have those conversations with couples. You know, this is something they need to be prepared for if they're going down that route. And some are, and some have the means, and that's fine. But even thinking about things like that, will I actually be able to care for this child? I think is an important thing. So having this information ahead of time, being able to process it before you're hit with a potential crisis, gives people the space and time to make the decisions that are right for them. I think that that's where we go when that happens.
One important point off of what you were saying. So she mentioned that it's a 25% chance each time that you get pregnant, right? If it is a carrier couple. So it's really essential for any couple who either hasn't been tested before or hasn't updated their panel to do so between pregnancies.
Mm-hmm.
You can have multiple healthy pregnancies and not have been tested. And then, you know, that third pregnancy or that fourth pregnancy ends up being affected. And you would have never known that you were a carrier couple. So this is essential information for couples to have on their radar throughout their family planning process, not just before the first one, but even in between pregnancies.
Hillary, give us an idea. Oh, Elliot, were you saying something?
Yeah, I want another personal story that I think will illustrate one other factor here. We have 4 children. One of my daughters and married to a wonderful man, and he knew that he was a carrier of Tay-Sachs. So my daughter had to be tested. First time inconclusive, second time inconclusive. Now this was 20 years ago, so things might be very different now. Third time inconclusive. So that meant that my wife and I had to be tested. So we went to Cedars, and I was 58, my wife was 57, and the nurse looked at us and said, "You guys planning on having children?" I said, "No, been there, done that." So it turned out that neither one of us was a carrier, so that meant that my daughter was not. And so they've had 3 healthy children, but they're going to have to be tested, right? Because their father's a carrier. So this goes through generations. So the information that you get through this kind of testing is not only for your children, but actually for your grandchildren.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of that, in terms of age, Hillary, give us an idea of what average ages, what range are people getting tested through JScreen? Do you keep a track of that?
So we do. Really, our testing, our reproductive test, I should say, is really for anyone 18 to 45. So those childbearing years, this is for reproductive risk. So of course, if someone's over that 45-year-old range and planning on having children, we'll allow them to come through. But as a nonprofit, we particularly try to spend our resources on people who are actually planning for future families. As Daniela mentioned, all different people come through at different times. So in the more Hasidic and Orthodox circles, they come through at a younger age, so closer to that 18, because they're using this in the dating world. So whether it's disqualification before dating, whether it's for, they won't get engaged, so they've gone on a few dates and aren't going to get engaged until they compare the results. So that's usually on the younger end of the spectrum. And then we have everyone in between, because right as you get older and add to your family, you still need to get screened, as we mentioned. So the people who have preschool aged kids or even older, and they're having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kids, they continually update their panel as they go on adding to their family. So, I mean, we see all sorts of ages. One question that we get is this just for men? Is this just for women? It's for both members of a couple. So ideally, both members of the couple would be getting tested. If they want to choose just one, we would recommend the woman getting tested first, because they would be getting tested for Fragile X, which is the disease that Rabbi Dorf mentioned.
Just to clarify, the reason that the woman is related to the Fragile X is because that's one of those genetic diseases that's passed from the female to the sons, the moms to the boys. So men are not going to be carriers of Fragile X. They're only going to be affected with the condition.
I'm curious, Hillary, Daniela, Elliot has already shared a couple of stories. You have dealt with so many people that have been tested from different perspectives. I'm wondering if you can share one or two stories of what happened. You know, people get tested, they get certain results. Sometimes it's results that they would rather not want to know, not positive, right? And then give us an idea of where this goes after a quote unquote bad news.
Mhm. I would like to actually share a story that maybe I think is not the typical kind of tragic story, but just to show how this information can play out in different ways. An Ashkenazi Jewish couple, two individuals of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. The female, they were planning on having their first child. The female, her gynecologist had ordered an Ashkenazi Jewish panel, which remember I said is kind of dated at this point, for her, and she came back negative, meaning everything was normal. And when she saw me, I told her that I didn't think that was enough. You know, if they're really motivated to have all the information before conceiving, that I would do more. We ordered a more comprehensive panel, and she did find out that she was a carrier for what is a very, very mild condition that can just affect blood clotting throughout that person's lifetime. It's not like hemophilia. You don't need any treatment or anything. It's really something just more to be aware of. If you have a major surgery, you should let the doctor know I have this thing. I might have some issues with clotting, and they might take a couple extra precautions. Nevertheless, we tested her husband. He was also a carrier. At first, this made her very, very concerned because suddenly they're both carriers for the same thing. But as we went through the condition and I sort of explained to her what it would mean if their child inherited two mutations, one from each parent, that 25% chance happened, they kind of took in the information and kind of realized, okay, this isn't something that we don't want to consider IVF for this. We don't really feel like we need to be using those interventions. We're very comfortable now that we know proceeding with the pregnancy. And, you know, the second that baby is born, they get their heel pricked, and we're going to add this condition to that genetic screening. It's called newborn screening, to determine if that baby has this blood condition, and we'll kind of go from there. Healthy pregnancy, everything was great. Baby was born, heel prick, no disease, and you know, that's it. But at this point, now they feel like they have the information of what their risks are. The baby was tested, she doesn't have it. And they've kind of they've checked all the boxes. They know there's not going to be, at least from this space, some surprises down the road, right? You know, they're not going to be in a situation where, let's say their child gets injured and for whatever reason, he or she is not clotting, and then the doctor runs tests and they find out there's this issue and they could have known before. And it's like kind of like this messy thing, even though it would get resolved. The crisis piece of it, that wrench into the mix, is kind of more controlled, more informed. So I think that's one example of a kind of the other, I don't want to call it extreme, but the diversity that exists within this genetic testing.
Hillary, can you share a story?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I feel really fortunate to be in the business of saving lives. Like, it doesn't get more fulfilling than that, to be able to give people this life-saving information. And, you know, sometimes it's not always easy to get it through to them that they should be getting screened. That tends to be the biggest challenge because of the so many misconceptions that they think, like, I don't need to get tested, or I would know if I'm a carrier. So, you know, we'll be at a young Jewish professionals happy hour, and I'm competing like with the drink specials of the night, like begging them to learn about J-Screen. But the most fulfilling part is that they eventually, the information somehow seeps through and they get tested. And then that leads, I've had so many stories, whether they won a kit at an event, or they saw us tabling at a happy hour, or they just saw about us on social media. And they really like we've had so many healthy babies born, and whatever way that's done, whether we told them they were a carrier couple, which I do want to mention, yes, it's a very small percentage of people who are going to be told the information that they're a carrier couple. Most people will get peace of mind and and their partner are a carrier of something. Almost 80% of the people, at least, who come through J-Screen carry at least one disease. So it's really common. It's not weird. There's no stigma attached to it. So the odds of being a carrier are exceptionally high, but being this carrier couple and at higher risk are much lower. But in those cases, we hear so many happy stories, and whatever route that is. So some couples have sent us pictures of their baby and they said, it was a long journey through IVF and PGT, but like we have our baby free of this disease and we wouldn't change a thing. And other couples, because of the mildness of the case, have gone on to just conceive naturally. And from day one, I can think of one couple, they altered the diet of the baby, and that was enough to maintain a healthy lifestyle. But that was the key. Knowing that they had to alter the diet from day one was life-saving, and their baby could have died if it was continuing to have the mother's breast milk. So it depends on the disease, but couples are so grateful. Yes, it might be a different journey than you had planned to how you're gonna, have that baby, but once they do, they just couldn't be more grateful for the information and not going in blind, right? We have the information available and the tools, you just need to take advantage of it. And I think that's the most important part of all of this.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I first started with this whole world 8 years ago, I think one of the very first things we said was we needed to demystify the field, because it's not something anybody's really interested in talking about.
Yeah.
They'd rather talk about that singles party that they're
Right.
invited to on Tuesday night, or the Shabbaton, something that's more joyful and upbeat. But this is something that's not very sexy. It's the prevention idea. And it's also taboo at the
Yeah.
same time. So I think if there's one thing we've tried to do in the past 8 years, was just to demystify through just plain straight talk education. And speaking of that, Daniela, I wonder if you encounter any special reluctance from any special ethnic groups.
No, I wouldn't say from any particular ethnic group. I think, luckily we have people like Rabbi Dorf who, on a very intellectual level, are able to explain why in the Jewish tradition, this is something that is okay and actually should be done. I think in general, people, not just in the Jewish community, across the board, I think more religious individuals, there's this question of this idea that, it's in God's hands, so we don't get to intervene with whatever that plan is. I think that sometimes it can get a little tricky there. And luckily at the institutions that I've been at, I was at Cedars, at UCLA. At Cedars in particular, we had a really great Rabbi Jason Weiner, who works at Cedars-Sinai, who is a huge advocate for all of these sorts of things. And when I had patients that were either Orthodox Jews or, that these questions came up, I would just call up Rabbi Weiner and say, please help me here. Do what you do, because I'm not an expert there. And I think that meeting people where they are, because that's the point, it's not my job to tell people what to do or how to live their lives. I can help them understand the information and make it work for them, but we definitely pull in resources to help us when needed. I don't think that I think, there's some ethnic groups that maybe have some distrust in general of the medical system, just because historically what's gone on with eugenics and things like that. 100 years isn't that long ago, really and truly. So I think we do a lot of demystifying and kind of debunking of those concepts. I think nowadays the biggest concern that people have, and I didn't watch it, but all week I've been getting questions about the 60 Minutes that happened on Sunday.
Yes.
So if anybody watched that, they know what I'm talking about. But this privacy concerns, where is my data going? Is the government storing my saliva sample? what happens? Is my DNA being sold? Are there, clones of me being made elsewhere? I mean, these are actual concerns that people have, and I understand them because there's a lot of chatter and a lot of misconceptions that occur. I think that the big difference that I'll emphasize again is clinical genetic testing that's done by a medical professional under the supervision of a medical professional versus direct to consumer testing. And that's, I think, the biggest line where the privacy rules or contract, I don't even know what you would call it, changes. When somebody orders a direct to consumer test that comes to their house without a medical professional, in that consent, which I've never read, I don't know if anyone actually reads all the small print, it is a for-profit company that then owns your data. So they can sell it, they can use it however which way they want, they can share it. So when you kind of consent to doing that, you are giving them your saliva sample to do as they wish with. These other labs that we use in the medical world, that is not the case. It does not get sold, it does not get shared, it does not get used for other experiments, the samples get discarded. It's a much stricter space where we do things. I think that we do a lot of education and informing individuals of things like that, because I think there's big concerns about privacy and about discrimination when it comes to genetic information. And there is a federal law in place that's been in place, I want to say since 2007, 2008. It's called GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, and it protects against employment discrimination and health insurance discrimination when it comes to genetic information. In the law, it's not written in that it protects against long-term disability and life insurance. So sometimes we have to kind of figure out with people, sometimes they prefer to get those policies in place before proceeding with testing. Other people either already have a policy in place or they're comfortable moving forward. I think it just depends. But those are the types of things that we're sort of faced with.
And that's why people should proceed with caution when doing genetic testing. So like with a JScreen, right, we're not direct consumer, although it's an at-home test, and we're utilizing the utmost HIPAA privacy standards. So all of our emails are encrypted, the database, it's secure, right? These are important issues because if someone's selling my information to a third party, like who knows where my personal data and genetic information is going to end up. Like that can and will, I'm sure, be held against me in some way in the future. So making sure about that. And David, just to touch on what you said about, are we finding that people are reluctant to getting tested? I also second what Daniela said. I don't see it as a reluctance at all. I see it more as many ethnic groups are unaware of the need for screening. So like with the Persian community, we talked so much in the past, 20, 30 years about screening Ashkenazi Jews that the Persian Jewish community has no idea that there's diseases that are more prevalent within their own community. So I think it's more about education and putting that information on the radar than them not being open to getting tested. And all different ethnicities, like on our panel, we screen for sickle cell disease. That's more common in people with African American and Latino background. So this is not exclusive to Jews by any means, but we do have a lot of research within like the Jewish genetic space on diseases that are more prevalent within people with Jewish background, regardless of what that ethnic background is.
So we don't have much time left, about 10, 15 minutes. Before we go to questions from the chat room, just was wondering, Elliot, if moving forward, one of the issues will be people in their 50s and 60s. I could see how we've made a very powerful case for young couples in the reproductive phase, or they're about to have a family, about to have kids and so forth, that this would be crucial information. Now, it seems to me though, that even if you've already had your kids, that there's a good argument to make, or you should also get tested. Can you talk about that?
Well, certainly in the example that I gave you before, certainly if that's going to help your children determine whether they need to be tested for, for a particular genetic disease, absolutely. Then people, in their 50s and 60s need to be tested for that. Beyond that, I mean, I think Hillary and Danielle would know better than I as to whether people in their 50s and 60s who already had their children can benefit from being tested as well. I mean, it is primarily really for people in their reproductive years.
Okay.
And by the way, what I would say to people in their reproductive years is, sure, once COVID is over, by all means, go to those parties, meet each other, you know, marry and have children. And we Jews we are in deep demographic crisis. Have 3 or 4 if you are able to. Okay, so there we go
It's
with
good
that.
for
right?
business. I like that.
Exactly right. Okay.
That.
But I mean, you can see being tested in the same sort of a way that you would see, you know, going to the gym when you used to be able to go to the gym, or eating in a proper way, and you know, and getting enough sleep and things like that. In other words, in the same way that you would normally be worried, you know, about taking care of your health. This is another piece of that,
Okay.
and
So-
it's really important that you do that.
I
Yep.
can just add a couple things. I think that the reason that it's focused on couples that are in the family planning stages is because that's when this information is actionable, meaning we use it to make decisions. You know, finding out that somebody's a carrier, some people are curious to know, which is fine. I mean, but again, somebody at the age of 56, knowing they're a carrier most of the time is going to have no impact. The where it comes into play and where I think it can be helpful is, you know, family history information,
Right.
family communication. So oftentimes these diseases, because they are so, they're rare, generally speaking, you're not going to see individuals with, you know, many relatives with Tay-Sachs. You'll see maybe in one family, there was this one cousin that had Tay-Sachs that died early, and that might not even be communicated through the family tree. So if individuals that are post family planning, post having their children, decide to go ahead and get tested, the most important thing is that they share that information with their children, with their siblings, with their nieces and nephews, because having that information is what then arms the next generation to say, oh, okay, we don't have a family history of this, but I could end up being the first one, right? So I should get tested and then see, does my partner need testing? And that's how it can kind of help. It's focused on people of reproductive age because, again, that's where it's actionable. That's where it comes into play. But I think what I see often, unfortunately, is someone will get tested and then not share their results with their family members because they did it for fun, or they don't think it's important, or maybe doesn't even occur to them. And that kind of stopgap is where we see, unfortunately, kind of tragedy happen later on because it wasn't communicated in the family. Hey, this is something that we've got.
Right. It's valuable information. Are there any special consideration for interfaith families or interfaith couples?
I would say the same, you know, because we're doing these pan-ethnic panels. Carrier screening is going to be recommended for anyone of reproductive age, really and truly. Again, there's going to be, of course, a higher chance that a couple of the same ancestry, the same ethnic background, whether that be, you know, Ashkenazi Jews, Persian Jews, African Americans, that they're carriers for the same things. However, it's still very possible that two people from completely different backgrounds end up being carriers for the same thing.
Yeah.
So it's
I was
important.
doing a talk last night, Daniela, and one of the women mentioned she's Ashkenazi Jewish, that her husband is actually a Tay-Sachs carrier. He's not Jewish, of Irish background. And they said, you know, nothing surprises us anymore, especially with Tay-Sachs and some of these other ones. They're very common in other ethnicities as well. Like cystic fibrosis, for very common amongst Caucasian non-Jews. It doesn't, regardless of your Ashkenazi, background.
How many diseases do you test for now?
So now our panel, our reproductive panel, is up to 226 diseases.
Oh,
Wow.
So.
How many people have you tested, Hillary? You have a rough idea?
So people are at all different stages within that process. Some have returned their kits, some have completed, but in the tens of thousands. And we're obviously aiming to be in the hundreds of thousands. So hopefully all the people on this webinar will now act as advocates for testing and really share the information with their friends and family members.
And all that information is on the JScreen website as well as genetestnow.com.
Yeah,
That's-
and I think, David, we should get to some of the Q&A. I want to make sure we save time for that.
We have 10 minutes, so go ahead. Hillary.
Perfect. Excellent. So someone wrote, what is the cost of the test? My daughter just got married. So for the reproductive genetic test, at least through JScreen, it's $149. And there is a coupon code through the Jewish Journal of LA. It's JJLA36, and that'll give you an additional $36 discount off the cost of the test. So again, it's JJLA36. And you can feel free to use that. And the
My understanding is that you subsidized a great part of that, correct?
so
Through philanthropy.
149 is exceptionally affordable thanks to our donors. We're able to keep the cost low. As a nonprofit and a public health initiative, our goal is to make this affordable and accessible. So someone can't afford even the 149, which this test, if you go to your doctor's office and your insurance doesn't cover it, it can be, in the thousands of dollars. So we want to make sure people are taking advantage of screening and not being stopped at the door because of the price tag. So that's really essential. The next question that they're asking, they said, I wanted to test for BRCA. Some people know that as BRCA, that's a cancer causing gene, because my maternal aunt just died from ovarian cancer. So how can I get tested for that? And so what we've been talking about here today is really around reproductive genetics. So diseases that we could actually pass on to our children, not that we have our own risk for, but actually starting now, JScreen has offered a cancer genetic testing panel, which is a separate test. So you either can choose the reproductive test or the cancer test, or you can do both, but you choose what the right test is for you. And that includes the BRCA, the BRCA genes, as well as 60 other cancer susceptibility genes. But again, that's telling you different type of information. While yes, it is pertinent to future children, but it also gives you information about your own future health.
Can I add something about that, Hillary?
Please.
So there are certain hereditary cancer predispositions like the BRCA1 and 2 mutations that are more prevalent in people of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. As Hillary mentioned, hereditary cancer and these reproductive genetics that we've been talking about today are really kept very separate in the genetics world. And that's because, again, being a carrier of Tay-Sachs, of things like that, doesn't impact your health. It's about reproductive risk. The hereditary cancer testing is something that talks about that person's risk for cancer going forward. It's something that doesn't affect children, but we know, men and women that carry BRCA mutations are at a much greater risk for certain types of cancers than the average person. So that would have an impact on that person's healthcare management. It's very important. If you have a family history of cancer, I definitely recommend talking to a healthcare provider, a genetic counselor, to see if hereditary cancer testing is something that's for you, that you would qualify for. Insurance usually covers it. It's something that we do very frequently, and it's becoming more prevalent. It isn't yet in the space in the Ashkenazi Jewish community the way carrier screening is, where we say do it for everyone. There's a lot of research that's going into that to hopefully get it to that point one day so we can actually prevent cancer. I mean, that's the ultimate goal. But getting there, this has been started, these genes were discovered later than like the Tay-Sachs genes and things. So we're seeing it play out in front of us now. But still a very important piece. So if you have a family history of cancer, always recommend talking to either a genetic counselor or healthcare provider about it.
And, Danielle, on that, they're asking if you can address the issue of diseases that present themselves later in life, such as genetic marker for colorectal cancer. So, right, like as part of this more broad cancer genetic test, you're not just getting the BRCA, but there's markers for other types of cancers. Ours includes over 40, so including colorectal, melanoma, pancreatic. So there's a whole slew of them.
Yeah, there's different genes that cause an impact on different cancer risks. They cause different levels of risk. It's kind of nuanced. The BRCA genes are increased risk for breast and ovarian cancer in women and male breast and prostate cancer in men. Generally speaking, the more common hereditary cancers that we think about are going to be ovarian, breast cancer, colon cancer, pancreatic cancer. Prostate cancer can be, but we also know it's very common in men, unfortunately. So things like liver cancer, lung cancer typically are not hereditary. But again, just being aware of that family history. A lot of families, you'll see that there's a lapse in communication. People don't want to talk about how, this relative or that relative was sick. People don't want to share. These are hard things to talk about. And I think having that family communication, sharing that information really to help keep the family healthy is so important. And then discussing that family history with a healthcare provider is really important. So again, if somebody has a family history of colon cancer that they're concerned about, and just to put it in perspective, having a paternal grandfather that had colon cancer at 83 is very different than having, a grandfather that had colon cancer at 40, or having, 3 brothers that all had colon cancer, at 35, 40, and 50. So really talking to someone about what is a concerning family history versus what just might be, unfortunately, people do develop cancer, is an important distinction.
Elliot, I can't help think, as I was hearing Daniela speak, about the things people would rather not talk about, that there's something so Jewish about diving into the things that human nature does
Right.
not want to talk about. And there's just, it's so Jewish. The idea, it's one of my favorite Jewish principles, is the idea of transcending human nature. Whether human nature makes you cling only to people who agree with you, cling only to your tribe, and not to care for the stranger because it goes against human nature, or whether human nature is, I don't want to talk about something that may have bad news. I feel today we tapped into something very Jewish.
Definitely. I mean, we have a very argumentative tradition. And what that enables us to do is to probe into all kinds of issues that maybe otherwise would feel, people would feel uncomfortable with them. I'll just give you one example of that. I did a session at the Brentwood Presbyterian Church on Judaism 101, basically. And I basically started out by saying, before I get to the substance of Judaism, you need to know that it's a very feisty tradition. We love to argue with each other. And this man came up to me afterward, late 50s, and he said, now I understand something. And I said to him, what do you understand? He was an aeronautical engineer at Northrop Grumman. And he said, in all my years, whenever I would suggest that we do something differently, I would get slammed down, except during the years that I had a Jewish boss.
Aha. We have the feisty gene.
Yeah, that's right. We have this gene that we're willing to think about other things, and we're willing to probe things, right? Isaac Raby, who got a Nobel Prize in physics, was asked, how did you come to do that? And he said, because when I came home, my mother didn't ask me, what did you learn today? She said, did you ask good questions today?
Ah, wonderful, wonderful.
I like that.
You embody that. We have 2 minutes to go, room for one more question. Before we ask that last question, I want to do a very special thank you to my longtime partner who's been with us on the Gene Test Now journey from the very beginning, my dear partner and colleague, Jonathan Fong, who helped put this webinar together and is deeply involved with this project.
Yes.
Go ahead, Hillary, one more question.
So this person said that they're worried about the accuracy of doing the testing at home. So they said, should I be worried? And also, I don't believe that my insurance would cover this type of testing. So just on the insurance component, even if insurance doesn't pay a cent, if you do testing through JScreen, we cover the rest. So you're only responsible for that $149 program fee. And that's, again, the point. So regardless of if your insurance covers it, you're only responsible for the $149. In terms of accuracy, I can start, and Daniela, if you have anything to add. I mean, we're using state-of-the-art sequencing technology that is very accurate. We're very confident in this test. It looks at the whole gene, so it's not just common mutations that in the Jewish community or whatever community it is. So it's the highest detection rates possible.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think there's a lot of questions about if saliva is as accurate as blood. And yes, it is as accurate. The way that we actually do genetic testing from saliva is from cheek cells that get washed off into your saliva. And those cheek cells are the same cells that make up every other piece of you in your body. People often, I think something that helps people kind of understand is when you send in a saliva sample, there's a chance that if it's JScreen, if it's another lab, they'll tell you, you know what, this saliva sample didn't work. We need you to actually send in another one. So they're not going to get like a false result from a bad saliva sample. They'll actually get a result that says we cannot complete the test. Like there's not quality sample here to do this. And they'll ask you to spit again. So in terms of accuracy, the test is going to be just as accurate when you do saliva as when you do blood. Sometimes though with saliva, you will need to kind of provide another sample if the sample wasn't of the quality needed to perform an accurate test. So there are checks in place to make sure that it's getting you the information that it needs to get you.
Okay, I have a very punctual Gene, and I see now that it's 1 o'clock. And I want to thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation. Hillary, Daniela, Rabbi Dorf, I'm so glad you were able to join us today. And on behalf of Sharon Glazer and the whole team at Gene Test Now and JScreen, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay healthy, everyone.
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed.